You're listening to the Lead Like No Other podcast, episode 89. If you've ever had somebody around you that's told you you can't do something, or maybe you've said it about yourself, you talk yourself out of doing something, this episode is for you. I had the great honor of interviewing a friend and a mentor of mine, Alison, who hosts a wildly successful podcast called Screw the Naysayers. And before that, had several other very successful businesses. And what we're going to talk about today is how to get over either our own negative self-talk or the negative self-talk that somebody puts in our head about why we can't do something. Because if ever there was a time, if you wanted to make a shift, this may be it. Again, I'm Patrick V, and you're listening to the Lead Like No Other podcast, where I am not only obsessed with interviewing those whose actions are inspiring others to do great things, such as Alison, but also in presenting the research that demonstrates that we all have the ability to rise above our best and to lead like no other, but it starts with ourselves. So let's get into it. Tim, I want to thank you for being on the Lead Like No Other podcast today. It's in just the amount of time that I've known you, I've gained so much respect for you, and you've been a mentor to me and on many levels. And to have you on today as a guest with the environment that we're in is so important. And I was hoping you could talk about your journey, where you started out, how you've gotten to where you are, because there's a lot in there that I think a lot of people could gain value from.
Well, first of all, Patrick, thanks for having me on, man. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, look, I mean, I guess most people tend to think of my story starting, about in my late 20s, and I was doing what a lot of people were doing at the time, Patrick, and that was chasing the bell at the top of the corporate ladder or whatever is hanging there as hard as I was. And I was very successful, from the outside looking in, really the poster child for what success was supposed to look like for people of my generation. I'm a boomer, so we're talking, late 1980s. That's how far back we're going. But at age 31, I was at that stage, I was in the top 2% of wage earners in the country. On the surface, I had everything I'd set out to get. I was married, I had 2 kids, I had a house backing onto a park in the city of Toronto. And when you have income in Toronto, it's a wonderful, it was then, it still is a wonderful place to live. But I was miserable, man. I mean, I was, the job was just taking, and I no longer blame it on the job. It was my inability to manage the job, for sure. I take all the ownership. There are a lot of people that did well and excelled in those kind of jobs, but I couldn't balance it all. I was still learning how to be a husband and a father, and and everything else. And at the same time, I was trying to kick ass and and I was so driven, Patrick, to be the top, at the top of the heap and to move up as fast as I can. So, long story short, because we could talk about that for a long time, but I quit. And not only did I quit, but my wife and I and our 2 kids, we moved from Toronto out to where I'm talking to you today. It's a little rural fishing village in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's a tiny little community where my wife has roots that go back some 250 years. It's some of the earliest North American settlers were Acadian settlers here in Nova Scotia. And it's still a lot like this today, man, but certainly back in 1988, these hands were not a guarantee of much business success because most everybody was working on fishing boats, and many still, obviously that's still our primary income around here, or in the woods or in construction. Like, men had good, solid, blue-collar, hard-working jobs, and I have the world of respect for everybody who does those jobs, and that's who my friends are, living around here. But it wasn't for me. So, I mean, I started an educational software company, and there were certainly more than a few people who were lining up to tell me that. I really remember clearly this conversation. I went to meet with the economic development officer for the province of Nova Scotia. I drove up to Halifax, which was a 3-hour drive. And I sat down with him and I explained what I was planning to do and that I was going to start this company in this little fishing village. We were going to sell software. And he leaned back in his recliner and he crossed his arms and he shook his head. And these are his exact words. He said, "Your business will never succeed in that community." And this guy was getting paid to encourage economic development in the province. We did okay, and I've been here for 32 years now. I'm self-employed every single year.
And you're being modest in terms of you did okay. How okay did you do?
Well, man, I mean, we scaled, we hit about 10 million in sales. And, it took us about 4 or 5 years to I think, hit the 7-digit line. And then from there, it ramped pretty quick. And And we did that for 18 years. And, Patrick, I mean, it's like a lot of industries. I mean, here's one of the things that people don't think about as entrepreneurs. Sometimes businesses just run their cycle. And I had caught a niche. I was right in the early days of computer-based training, really, is what we called it back in those days. The term e-learning didn't exist. But, by the early 2000s, it was going through quite a change. And massive publishers, people like Pearson Publishing, would buy Simon & Schuster, who would then buy all these software companies, mostly with the intent of closing them, because they really didn't like the competition that all the software was bringing to the industry. And so, and the technology was changing so fast that I remember building the last product that we created, and I had co-produced it with Houghton Mifflin, a publishing company from, not too far from your neck of the woods.
I remember the school books.
And I just sold it to them for not a whole lot of money at that stage, but we'd had an amazing 18-year run, and raised, of course, by now our kids at that stage, our kids were either out of university or off to college. And since then I'm on my fourth business in this day and age with Screw the Naysayers. So, which is
a wildly successful podcast. I love listening to it myself,
you.
Which we'll get to, because I think, you just mentioned at least your first example of a naysayer when you went to this official from economic development. What was that like leaving there? Because I think that's an important lesson for people.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, I don't think this is, I'm always cautious at this stage when I'm thinking back that many years to make sure I'm not just remembering what I want to remember as opposed to what really happened. Well, it does happen, man. And I'm upfront about it to acknowledge it. But honestly, it didn't bounce off me. It bounced off me. I sort of thought, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm not going to tell you that I did not. Here's the thing, man. I did not have a clear vision. And I know that everybody will say you got to have the vision, know exactly where you're going. I didn't have a bloody clue, Patrick. I really didn't. What I knew was that I was really good at sales. I knew that for my time, I was one of the most well-informed people in Canada when it came to educational technologies, and not in terms of building it, but when I saw educational technology, I could tell you what was good about it, what could be improved, what needed to be improved, or if it was crap. And I had built a lot of relationships. And so I had that on the one side. I was pretty confident in my ability to do something. And then the flip side was that we were just so determined. My vision in those days was about my family. And it was about, we're not getting dragged out of this community. This is where we want to live. We built our house. It's on land that had been in the family for forever. And so that was my determination. But if you'd asked me in those early days, what was my business going to look like? Or if it suggested to me that I would end up selling $10 million worth of software into an education marketplace, I would have said, you're crazy. Because I started the business selling to corporations and helping them set up. But back in those days, they were called learning centers. And they put in, or information centers is what they called them. And they put in computers to teach their staff how to use computers for the most part. That's the way the technology really started. I ended up doing okay there, but I made all my money, my serious money, in the field of adult literacy education, literacy and numeracy education, for selling to schools and colleges and nonprofits. So,
Now, on your website, Screw the Naysayers, you have a quote on there that says, know the life you want and have the courage to live it.
That came to my mind, Patrick, in about 2005. I was writing my first book, which I don't really think's out there anymore, but the good thing, really, because that was a bit of a hero's journey that didn't necessarily reflect all of the realities. But it did sum up the message that I had then, and I still have for everybody that's out there, in particular young people, but I'm realizing now it applies to all ages. Whatever your belief system is, most of us believe that at least on planet Earth here, we're getting one trip through. There are certainly others that have different views, but I think it's such a shame if we don't actually go for the things that we really want. Like, I think about how my life changed when we decided that we were going to, come down here and move to Nova Scotia, and the friendships that I made. And, I'm living, like I'm talking to you right now, looking out at the same forest I've been looking at for 30 years. And it's all I see out of this window. There's no sign of humanity. There's no power lines or anything. It's there if I were to go look out the front of my house. But I mean, if I hadn't gone for it, or if I'd accepted, because even after I got down here, So, and still even today, so many of our young people leave these communities, and it's true in every rural community. They're leaving not because they want to leave the community, but because they don't think they can get the economic opportunity. Yeah. So whereas my goals in the early days were very much centered on solidifying my family's ability to stay, I'd say within about 4 or 5 years, my vision had evolved to, to my purpose, if you may, was about inspiring and educating other people on, on the fact that you don't have to, move to accommodate somebody else's vision of what success should look like. And for some people, it means moving to a different community. It might mean a different career. It might mean just getting the perspective that you need to prosper in your current career. But you've got to, if you don't try now, I mean, whatever age you are, try now. Because I guarantee you, like, at my age, there's a study on happiness, Patrick, that I wish everybody would have a look at. It's from a lady named Jennifer Aker, and she's a psychologist at Stanford University. And she identified, 5 stages of happiness. And she did it based on her and her research team. They went out and they studied, don't quote me on the number, but I believe it was like millions of blogs and public sector, things that was in the public domain. And they searched for words that were associated with happiness, sadness, those kind of things. And then they, looked at ages and stuff like that. And what she identified was 5 stages, that everybody sort of moves through at different paces and at different times. But the 5th one, which is the last one, and I'm old enough, I'm coming up on my 63rd birthday. I will be honest, sometimes I filter into that last stage and then I pull myself back. But the last stage is savoring. And that's when we start to look in the rearview mirror and we think about the life we've lived. And we start asking, did we do the things that we want to do? We don't. And what I can tell you absolutely right now is I've had failures. Everybody who's lived a life has had failures. And I've had a life of taking a lot of risks and things like that. I don't even think about them when I look in the rearview mirror. And I'm largely satisfied because when I look, I see that, okay, there were things that I wanted and we went for it. But I will tell you that there are an awful lot of people my age and older. They're now looking back and they're going, oh, crap. I really didn't. I stuck at something that I wasn't enjoying, or I was afraid to try for something because I just couldn't convince myself that it was possible. I refused to believe in the possibilities, and people regret. I know everybody hears this, but it's so true. And I'm old enough to say this with certainty. The only thing we regret as we get older is the things we didn't try.
Yeah.
Nobody will tell you that, that they regretted trying something that, that didn't work out. So it's been my mantra for a good 20 years now or so, probably really my whole life. And that's the purpose behind Screw the Naysayers and pretty much everything I do these days.
It's interesting, and you may have heard of this as well, as a book that was published, and it was the 5 Regrets of the Dying. And it was a woman that had actually started a blog that was a hospice worker. Yeah. And what she did was she was interviewing people as she was going around in their homes and asking them, what are the things that you wished you had done? And that is one of them, is I wish I had taken more risks.
Yeah, for sure.
When I was younger. And I think it's Les Brown that I heard him say once that most people die in their 20s or 30s, but they're not buried until they're in their 70s.
Yeah. And just think of the number of people that we know who are 40 years old and already counting down the days to retirement.
Yeah.
And saying, well, I can't quit the job because here's the thing that happens, especially for people. And I want to be clear. Like, I'm not telling everybody that works in a corporate job that, you're stupid or whatever. I mean, people make their own choices. But what I observe in the corporate space is that people get to a certain stage. And in the early days, we're motivated by promotions, by progression, by increasing our salary. It's all external based things, but they're achievements, and they're enough, even if we're not enjoying the job. They're enough.
Yeah.
But a lot of people wake up in their late 30s or early 40s, and that pyramid in the organization's gotten awful small. And all of a sudden, there aren't any more progressions there for them. Or they're not willing to do what would be required in order to get to that next stage. And now you're sitting there saying, geez, I'm making $200,000. I got all these bills. I have my pension tied up here. I can't. You can. You might not like the short-term consequences of it, but I promise you, if you ride that out for another 25 years, you're not going to like that anymore. You're like it a lot less once you get to that age.
Yeah. It's so interesting, and some of this story from the work that we had done was that I lived or worked in an environment that was very much around that in the biotech industry, that
Yeah.
many people financially making healthy six-figure,
Yeah.
multiple six-figure incomes, but the majority of them very unhappy with what
Yeah.
they're doing, but feel as though, what do I do? I don't know what else to do. And financially, where am I going to go that's going to provide me with this type of security? And it really was a very difficult, on one level, to step away from that. And on the other end, knowing I'm never going to be happy if I
Yeah.
stay in this world. I just won't be.
Well, it was the same thing for me, man. I mean, believe me, like in 1988, 31-year-old kids didn't quit. I was in the top 2% of wage earners in the entire country in those days. And I hesitate to say this, but I'll put it in perspective. I mean, in today's dollars, I would have been making about $375,000 a year as a 31-year-old kid.
Yeah, it's like tiger by the tail.
So people didn't quit those things. And I'm not saying that was easy. What I will say in hindsight is that there are some things that you simply cannot put a price on. Time with your family and your mental health. If something about your job is not congruent with your values, it's a recipe for, and I talk to people on my show all the time, and you do too, or we meet them elsewhere. It's a recipe for heart attack. It's a recipe for divorce. It takes some for a lot of people, it takes that infrastructure rattling event. And what we're having right now, this is kind of like the switch, and I don't know the exact day this is going out, but I know what's going on right now isn't going to get fixed real fast.
Great transition. Yeah.
Here's the thing, Patrick, big infrastructure rattling events present, although it's so hard for us to see it in the moment, they present the biggest opportunities for us to make significant changes in our life. And so when I look at the people that I've had on my show, and I think, for example, of Marcus Aurelius Anderson. Marcus was preparing to go overseas with the U.S. infantry and had a training accident. So he spent his 40th birthday in the hospital, paralyzed from the waist down, divorced, broke, had died twice on the operating table, and the doctor said to him, "You'll never walk again." And that guy today, I mean, I could take you through his whole journey because it was a long one. That guy today is going across the country. He's one of the most inspirational, informative speakers you could ever get in a room. He studies martial arts under one of Bruce Lee's disciples. He's mobile and moving around and all these kind of things. I mean, I could go on for an hour on just the people I've had on my show. I know this, like, we see these big examples. I'm concerned a bit. I think people need to realize that it's not just the superheroes like that can do this. Everyday people are making these kind of changes all of the time. And I do also know this, that when you get to like 40 or 50 or 60, when we look in the rearview mirror and start thinking about what's gone on and the pivotal moments, if somebody says, what was the pivotal moment, Patrick, most of the time we're going to point at something which at the time we wanted to wish away. Like, I'm sure Marcus would have given anything not to have been in that accident. But now he's written a book called The Gift of Adversity and says it was the best thing because it woke him up. And he said, man, I've wasted 40 years of my life. And this is a guy that was serving in the U.S. military and taking on some really dangerous missions. And I'm intellectually saying that's not wasted. But he says, you don't get it. Like, I was going through life taking things for granted. J.T. McCormick would say that, when he lost his first million, that, I realized that I was becoming like my father and I wasn't respecting the people around me and all these kind of things. I hear these things over and over and over again. And so, it's take control of it yourself. Or, the universe is very likely going to one of two things for you: either kill your spirit or cause something really bad to happen.
Yeah.
And here we are. And I know it's tough, but I mean, gosh, some of the people I've had on my, the interviews that I've had have been released. I mean, I was talking to Jack Canfield the other day, Chicken Soup for the Soul. And he was saying, stop looking at the challenge, look at the opportunities. And Mark Victor Hansen, whose episode hasn't been released yet, but he's the co-writer of that series with Jack. He believes, and this guy's got a lot of credibility. He's done some incredibly amazing things aside from co-authoring, books that have sold 500 million copies. But he says the 20s are going to make the roaring 20s from the 1900s, the last century that people hear about, look like nothing. He feels that with the technology advancements that are there, that we're sitting on the cusp of, hard as it is to see, some of the biggest innovations and the biggest positive change that mankind's ever seen. And so if we take this chance, and if we're at home and we got time, if we take this chance to really ask the question, uh, what's going on right now? What kind of problems exist in this world that do I really care about? How can I help somebody solve that problem? And right now, you might be just helping them solve it for free, or whatever. It doesn't matter on the short term unless you're starving. You know, the opportunities are there. It's just mentally so tough, and I get it. Mindset's always been important, but I think now more than ever, the people that can focus the next 10 years, as long as we come out of this, knock on wood, with our family and loved ones healthy and safe. We know some won't, and I never would minimize that. But the rest of us can't live in fear.
Right.
And let, dig, because there's something there.
Yeah. It makes me think of a couple different things. One is we are at historic levels in terms of unemployment.
Absolutely.
Because of this, many of those, jobs may not return. And it is an opportunity for people to reflect, to say, what do I want the next chapter of this to be? And I'm a firm believer in what you talk about. One of the episodes that I did, which was a solo episode, talked about the 3 deaths in my life that I continue to learn from. And that was the death of my parents at a young age, the death of a marriage, and the death of a career. And each one of those things in their own places, I would not want to revisit any one of those, but I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for all 3 of those.
That's exactly what I'm saying, man. It's exactly what it is. And it's going to be the same for everybody. There are going to be these moments, and it's just that for the first time, certainly for younger generations, but maybe even for us, but certainly for the younger generations, I'll say 30 and under, this is the first time you've ever been presented with this kind of global, I hate to say it, opportunity. Because, we know, like when I hear people say it's unprecedented, pardon me, it is. This kind of rapid unemployment hasn't been seen since the Depression, but it's not unprecedented. It did happen in the Depression. We've seen, Black Monday, I was, in the Royal Bank Tower, which is the largest bank in Canada, on Black Monday in 1987, which prior to a couple of weeks ago was the single biggest drop in the Dow Jones and the TSX and all the major exchanges in a single day ever. Yeah. I think, Patrick, that day, if the windows in that, that office tower had opened, people would have been jumping out just like they did in, 1929. We lived through 9/11. We lived through, the dot-com crash. We've lived through the 2008 financial crisis. It feels by scope bigger. I don't know. I know that we've seen massive change and massive problems before. And out of every one of those changes, we've seen people really prosper. Yeah. And so the choice people have to make, and it is a choice. Are you going to spend your time binge watching Netflix, drowning your sorrows in a bottle, or whatever your source of inspiration, failed attempted inspiration is? Or are you going to use the time to reflect, use our time alone a bit to just figure out what's really important to us? Look around us as well. I think there's going to be lots of opportunities for local businesses. Everybody's so focused on building these global empires, but out of this is going to come a sense of community, and figure out, well, what people are going to want to change. And even around employment, man, one thing I would also add, like some of those jobs may not exist. I got newsflash for a lot of employers. There's a whole lot of employees that aren't going to want to come back. And there's a whole lot of employees that have been doing their work at home who are going to say, you know what, I don't mind if you want to let me keep doing this and, wearing my casual clothes and all that. But if you want me to do the 2-hour commute every day and report for duty and salute you, then yeah, well, no. I agree. I mean, it's going to be, big change, and it's going to come at a pace.
Totally.
That if we're ready for it, mentally and physically.
It reminds me of a quote. Abraham Lincoln once said that one can succeed is evidence that it's available to all of us.
And, we keep, again, just back to this whole idea of, which I've been ruminating on a lot, is that I keep bringing on all these inspiring guests, but there's such a tendency in society to say, but that's Jack Canfield, or that's, like Jack came from nothing, poverty, and in fact spoke, his parents are long gone, but, wasn't, didn't have a lot of respect for the way the attitudes and the negativity and everything else that he grew up around, and all these kinds, just about everybody that I know that's really crushed it, they weren't handed it. They weren't born into it. And, they've really got, 2 legs, 2 arms, most of them, not all of them, most of them, and a brain. And, look, man, I mean, nobody knows me, or at least before Screw the Naysayers. And, but I've carved out this life. I mean, I had an astonishing 2.7 GPA at university or college. I mean, rah,
I think I was right there with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's another sector. I mean, we don't have much time, but I mean, I'm telling you what, education from top to bottom, you got parents sitting at home realizing, oh, the kids don't have to be in front of the teachers, and the teachers really are not doing that great. Some of the teachers are actually, I'm hearing, doing a better job Zooming their kids than they were in front of the classroom. No offense to the teachers, but the system they're in is so badly broken that it needs to be destroyed. And how about the colleges that are still charging the full weight, and everybody's sitting at home doing it on their own.
I've got one in the other room.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm just thinking that, we've known that sector's been ready for massive disruption.
Yeah.
It's got to happen here. Like, I just think people are going to say, not to mention the fact that, in the short term, there's a whole lot of investment portfolios that were put in place to try and pay for education and stuff like that have taken a pretty significant hit. My advice to people is to think long and hard. Yeah. If your son or daughter wants to be a doctor, a scientist, those kind of things, by all means, but they're leaning it all towards the future of jobs seems to be in self-employment, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, how many of us are going to be working for ourselves in another 10 years, Patrick? No. Not at all sure that traditional education is the way to go, man.
Yeah. There's a tagline that I will often use in some of the work that I'm doing with youth at times, but it resonates, I think, with adults as well, as this idea that your past is your power. And as it relates to your past, anything that you think about from where you are that you would look and say where you can trace that to today and say my past is my power?
Yeah, well, honestly, I think I probably shared this with you, but it truly, Patrick, for me, it goes all the way back to my childhood. So I was born with brittle bones, and basically my bones, it's like having osteoporosis for life. Like, since childhood, my bones did not absorb calcium very well. So as a kid, I probably had, 15 broken legs by the time I was 15 years old. So I spent most of my childhood, in white plaster casts, and like, I'm the guy who couldn't get a date to the senior prom. And because, it turns out that, girls in high school are not all that, turned on by the hunk of a guy that's on crutches all the time. And hopefully maybe some of that's changed today. But, and so at the time, of course, I hated it. I really did. And it took me a long time to understand the gift that it gave me. But, people often ask, the question I used to get so often is, how did you find the courage to quit that job and do what you did against all the advice and, putting the financial future of your family and everything else at risk? And the crazy thing is, Patrick, it didn't feel risky to me. And I realize now is that for a long time, my risk filter, people say, well, you've got a much higher risk tolerance. Well, I do when it comes to money. It doesn't mean I don't respect money. I like money a lot, and I'm careful of it, but I do when it comes to money. Because when I'm presented with something, I think I would really like to do that. That sounds fun. That sounds like it's something that would align with my values, that would be meaningful. The risk filter that I'm paying most attention is a simple question. What are the odds of me ending up in the hospital needing surgery, like, for a broken bone or something? And most of the times in life, we're fortunate enough not to have to be faced with that kind of risk. And it just allowed me to just not freak out if, because the other thing I've learned in business, I mean, if you put in your time and your effort with an open heart and with good intent, you always get paid for what you do. But you don't always get paid at the same time you're putting in the effort. So there are times when you're working your butt off and you're not making money, or an idea didn't work, and you think, oh man, I mean, there's 50 grand that I've spent a year of my time or whatever, but it's not gone. It really isn't. You've put it out into the universe, you've learned all this stuff, but you're going to get over doing something else. And then all of a sudden that thing's going to hit. That thing only hit because of what you did before. And it's the same in the sales game, for heaven's sakes. Like, some days you can be sitting in the office and you get a phone call. Oh, that's a bluebird. I haven't talked to Joe in 2 years, except in 2 years, you talked to Joe 10 times. You just forget these things, eh? Yeah. So it's about I don't want to say put our head down and grinding, because I'm not a believer in that, but it is about, persevering. People ask me, that's the other question I get is like, how did my business succeed against all those odds when, almost all of the other businesses, in this community and in this province that started the same year as me, they're long gone. And I can't tell you, because I don't know what everything they did. I mean, I don't know that I did anything that special as a business person, but I know the one thing I didn't do is I didn't quit. I found a way to persevere, and doesn't mean I didn't pivot and change tactics. I don't believe in just keeping doing the same thing over and over and over again. If it's not working, you got to figure something else out.
Yeah.
But there was no quit in me. Like, I was not going to give up on the dream of living here in Nova Scotia and raising our family here and inspiring other people to do the same. And if you can find your North Star, if people could figure out what that is, then you'll go through walls and it's not near as painful. It's like, and if you're agonizing about maybe that job's not coming back and you're worried about how you're going to support yourself, it's just wasted energy. What you need to do is to say, okay, well, what's my North Star? Like, what would I be willing to fight for? What do I feel so strongly about that I'll just do what I need to do? And our human mind has such capacity that if we can figure out, it was Michael Hyatt when he was talking about vision, when he basically was saying that, if the vision is strong enough, both you and anybody else you're working with or leading, the human mind, they'll find a way, to make it happen. And it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
What happens is that most people, if they're just focused on, well, I need to make money to support my family, that in and of itself isn't going to drive you enough, because you'll be aware there are other ways of doing it. You gotta find that North Star.
And I hear this all the time. To me, it's almost the difference between willpower and why power. That willpower is, it can wane out, whereas if you have why power, that's, to me, is that star that keeps you.
Yeah, there is the occasional exception. Ruben Gonzalez, as an Olympic athlete, is one guy I think of that pure willpower of just never quitting is one. But almost everybody else that I know, it's the why. It's always the why. And people sit there and say, well, I don't know what my why is. And, just don't overcomplicate it. If you really get back and think about the things that you really care about, those are the things you fight for.
Yeah.
And that you want others to have. And, and also don't be afraid to put yourself first, because that's the other thing. When I talk to entrepreneurs, especially early stage entrepreneurs, I'll ask them, well, what do you hope to achieve with your business? And almost everybody's going to have some version of, well, I want to have an impact. Well, wonderful. Good for you. And I want to have an impact too. But that in and of itself isn't going to get you out of bed on the days when you're discouraged and the news is all bad and your spouse has gotten depressed about something and everything just seems to be closing in, or your partner. It doesn't work. What'll get you out of bed is something internal. And so what's in it for you?
Yeah. And
if what's in it for you is to be able to have freedom of lifestyle, independence, to make sure you can spend, control your own calendar to spend time with your kids, put that right in on a Post-it note in your forehead. Say, that's what I'm working for.
Yeah.
I'm not working just for the money. I'm working for these things, and
well, Tim, thank you so much for this, taking the time. And as I mentioned, you're somebody that I've grown to have a great deal of respect for. I love what you're doing now, and I'm glad you had the opportunity to really share, I think, your experiences and inspiration to help other people really find a way that in this challenge, we can all grow from this.
Yeah, we can. Patrick, thanks so much for having me, man. And the respect's coming right back at you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.
Tim Allison is the man. If you haven't had a chance to listen to his podcasts, you're missing out. It is one of the best podcasts out there in terms of the interviews and the guests that he has. I have learned so much listening to that podcast. And again, in regards to his story and how you can find success in your own life, there are so many things that you can draw from that. If you know somebody that you think might be interested in this, I'd ask you to forward it on to them. If you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe. And it would mean the world to me if you would leave a rating or a comment about this or any other issue, because that is how this message of helping each other to rise above our best and to lead like no other happens. So until then, I hope you're able to do both. Peace.